Hello and welcome to Arise News. It's Saturday the 11th of March. I'm Charles Aniagolu in Nigeria's capital Abuja. This is Arise News now. Our main headlines this morning. The United Nations says the world is facing its biggest humanitarian crisis since 1945, with 20 million people facing the threat of starvation and famine in Somalia, South Sudan, Nigeria and Yemen. Plus, President Buhari of Nigeria is expected to resume presidential duties on Monday, 3 days after he returned to the country following a 7-week absence on medical leave. And the widows of 5 Brazilian football players who died in a plane crash in Colombia last year have begun legal action against their club, Chapecoense. The United Nations has renewed its warning of the scale of the humanitarian crisis facing 4 African countries in Africa and the Middle East: Somalia, South Sudan, Nigeria and Yemen. The UN's chief humanitarian coordinator, Stephen O'Brien, said more than 20 million people were at risk of starvation and famine. Mr. O'Brien said the crisis presented the world with its biggest challenge since the UN was established at the end of the Second World War.
All counterparts promised to facilitate sustained access and respect IHL. Yet all parties to the conflict are arbitrarily denying sustained humanitarian access and politicize aid. Already, the humanitarian suffering that we see in Yemen today is caused by the parties and proxies, and if they don't change their behavior now, they must be held accountable for the inevitable famine, unnecessary deaths, and associated amplification in suffering that will follow. The situation is worse than it has ever been. The famine in South Sudan is man-made. The parties to the conflict are parties to the famine, as are those not intervening to make the violence stop. Aid workers have been killed. Humanitarian compounds and supplies have been attacked, looted, and occupied by armed actors. Recently, humanitarians had to leave one of the famine-affected counties because of fighting. Assurances by senior government officials of unconditional access and no bureaucratic impediments now need to be turned into action on the ground. To be clear, we can avert a famine in Somalia. We have a committed, clear, new president, a humanitarian and resilience track record, a detailed plan. We're ready, despite the incredible risks and danger. We have local and international leadership. We have a lot of access. Now we need the international community, at the scale of you, the donor agencies and nations, to invest in Somalia. It's life-saving, but we do need those huge funds now. We stand at a critical point in our history. Already at the beginning of the year, we are facing the largest humanitarian crisis since the creation of the United Nations. Now, more than 20 million people across 4 countries face starvation and famine. Without collective and coordinated global efforts, people will simply starve to death. All 4 countries have one thing in common: conflict. This means that we, you, have the possibility to prevent and end further misery and suffering. The UN and its partners are ready to scale up, but we need the access and the funds to do more. It is all preventable. It is possible to avert this crisis, to avert these famines, to avert these looming human catastrophes.
Now, President Buhari of Nigeria has written a letter to the Senate notifying the upper house of parliament of his intention to take back power and resume presidential duties on Monday. President Buhari returned to Nigeria after an absence of 51 days from office for what was described as medical leave. On arrival, he confirmed that he'd been ill, contradicting weeks of official denial about his health. Rumors were rife when President Buhari asked the National Assembly to extend his stay in the UK to take a series of medical tests, and there was much speculation about how bad his health might be. But despite the fact that Mr. Buhari himself has said that he's never been so sick as he felt in recent weeks, the Nigerian government is still refusing to disclose exactly what was wrong with him. Well, one man who's been watching all this rather closely is our news analyst, John Fashion, who joins me now in the studio. It's quite curious, isn't it, that President Buhari was so honest about his illness and was quite prepared to talk volubly about it. And yet, for weeks, the Nigerian government was obfuscating and essentially didn't want to give anybody any clue about whether, in fact, he was sick at all.
Well, Charles, I would say that it's actually unprecedented. I don't think in the history of presidents we've actually seen somebody who's been almost uncomfortably honest.
That is a very good point.
And I think that in itself has drawn a lot of love from a lot of people. You know, Charles, he could have come back as a president and said his normal pitch was this, which was possibly not true, but he's come out and he said, this is exactly my state, where I am. The only thing he hasn't said is what was the ailment, what is the ailment, is it going to come back again, are we going to have other problems? So we are a little bit worried still.
That's a very good point, John, because of course he did hint that he was going to go back again for further tests. But I think the other thing that I noticed that a lot of people have been commending is the fact that he was quite keen to big up, if you like, the vice president who was acting on his behalf. He said the vice president was somebody who has youth and intellect.
That's it, yes.
Behind him, and that for him, President Buhari, what he has is age and only military training.
Experience.
Yeah, behind him, which is
Yes.
really quite funny,
Yes.
but in a very poignant, very honest sort of
Yes.
statement.
Well, I would say, Charles, that actually they are actually forming a wonderful bond, because you want a father-son relationship. You're not expecting the president to be dotting around different states and doing all the things the vice president or acting president has been doing. So I would say that it's actually coming to a very nice position where you have father and son, and the son has as much respect for his dad as his dad has for his son. It's a nice position to be in. And I would think if I was the president, I'd be very, very happy and trusted having a wonderful vice president like that.
Absolutely, and I think as one of our panelists yesterday mentioned, people should not forget that both the vice president and the president are part of the same government, and therefore whatever the vice president does is being done on
Precisely.
behalf of the government, and ultimately President Buhari also takes credit for it.
Definitely. And I think that, you know, just having a look and just seeing what the vice president has been doing, I mean, he really has working hard.
He has
You know,
worked
It's a
hard.
tribute to the president.
Absolutely.
Of course. You know, one of the pictures which we like, and I'm very happy with, we see on This Day, is a wonderful picture of Mr. President with the people who really love him. Nobody can love you more than your family.
Absolutely.
Here he's got his wife Aisha and his daughter Zara as well, all around him amongst other cousins and people like that. And I should think that Mr. President right now feels very happy and
Absolutely.
feels very safe.
And certainly good to be, I suppose, for him and for most Nigerians, for him to be back home. We're obviously going to get more into that in your paper
yes,
review later
yes.
this morning. John, thank you very much
Thank
indeed.
you,
John Fashion, our news analyst there. Now, the widows of 5 Brazilian football players who died in a plane crash in Colombia last year have begun legal action against their club, Chapecoense. They're demanding more compensation, saying the sum they'd been promised by the club failed to take into account potential earnings for product endorsements. 71 people, including 19 Chapecoense players and other staff, died as they traveled to play the first leg of the Sudamerica Cup final. The plane crashed as it approached Medellin Airport. There's tight security in the South Korean capital, Seoul, where rival groups are planning further rallies a day after the Constitutional Court confirmed the impeachment of President Park Geun-hye. A third person died in hospital on Saturday after losing consciousness during clashes on Friday. Ms. Park remains in the presidential palace and has made no public statement since the ruling. Now, a judge in Washington state has declined to rule in a hearing seeking a restraining order on President Trump's revised travel ban. Without addressing the merits of any new arguments, Judge James Robart told lawyers acting for states opposed to the ban that they needed to file a complaint and more extensive court papers before he could make a decision. Judge Robart was described by Donald Trump as a so-called judge when he issued a temporary restraining order against the president's first travel ban. Mr. Trump's new order temporarily blocks the issuing of visas to citizens of 6 mainly Muslim countries and has met legal resistance from several U.S. states. Now, the White House says President Trump has invited the Palestinian leader Mahmoud Abbas to visit the United States very soon. Mr. Trump made the offer in their first telephone conversation since he took office. The president has spoken of wanting to facilitate a Middle East peace deal, but Palestinian leaders are concerned that U.S. foreign policy is becoming more pro-Israel under the Trump administration. Last month, Mr. Trump said the U.S. would no longer insist on a two-state solution. Now, a fire sparked by the derailment of a freight train carrying ethanol through rural northwest Iowa is still burning nearly 24 hours later. But an environmental officer in the U.S. state of Iowa said there appeared to be no significant leakage of ethanol into the creek. The train derailed and burst into flames early on Friday as it crossed a bridge over a stream that empties into the Des Moines River. 2 train crew members escaped unharmed and no injuries have been reported. Officials expect the fire to burn out by Saturday, allowing investigators and railroad crews to better assess the damage and clean up the area. Malik Obama, the U.S. half-brother of former U.S. President Barack Obama and a supporter of President Donald Trump, has reignited the controversy that dogged America's first African-American president throughout his term of office by tweeting an image of a document allegedly proving that President Obama wasn't born in Hawaii. The image, which first surfaced in an eBay auction in 2009 and was immediately debunked as a forgery, is of a birth certificate supposedly issued by the British Protectorate of Kenya in 1961. It's one of several documents circulated by proponents of conspiracy theories suggesting that President Obama was never qualified to hold presidential office because he could not establish his U.S. citizenship. Human rights lawyer Amal Clooney has been at the United Nations headquarters to speak on genocide in Iraq and Syria. Clooney, who represents victims of rape and kidnappings by members of the Islamic State, urged the United Nations member states to step up pressure on this extremist group. She urged Iraq's Prime Minister, Haider al-Abadi, to send a letter to the UN Security Council so it can vote to set up an investigation into crimes by the group in Iraq, where ISIS once controlled about 40% of the country's territory, but is now being routed by government and coalition forces.
Mass graves in Iraq lie unprotected and unexhumed. Witnesses are fleeing, and not one ISIS militant has faced trial for international crimes anywhere in the world. So I am speaking to you, the Iraqi government, and to you, UN member states, when I ask, why? Why is it that nothing